everyone, and welcome back to the channel. I am the Darklight Emissary, and today's episode is continuing our series on the Legion tactics and doctrines. And today's episode is on the 15th Legion, the Thousand Suns Legion. Now, this Legion is my personal favorite for a number of reasons. I've elaborated on in a previous video about this Legion, giving an overall general history of them. This is just focused more on just their doctrines and specific battle tactics, which are also one of the reasons I like them quite a bit. So to start off with this Legion, one of the first distinct features about them is that they are one of the smallest, if not the smallest Legion for the entire Great Crusade nearly. Perhaps the Emperor's Children Legion also was reduced to a small size. At one point they had their own issue, but the Thousand Suns were routinely dropped to about 1,000 Space Marines or less at several different times in the Great Crusade, and even after it as well. So they are one of the smallest legions to start off with. And then to add to that, one of the reasons they tend to stay small is because their gene seed is highly unstable, and so they mutate out of control until they have to be put down or basically dissipate on their own. So the gene seed has some issues. So both of those things combine to make them one of the smaller legions. And so with the smaller legion size, they have to make up for it somehow. And one of the ways they do make it up are by having a large degree of psychers. Nearly all of the Space Marines in the Thousand Suns Legion are a psyker of some repute or strength, including the most powerful psychers of the Great Crusade era. People like Ahriman, who is the chief librarian of this Legion, second in command underneath their Primarch, Magnus the Red, the most powerful psyker in humanity, with the exception of possibly Malcador and the Emperor. It's not exactly known if Magnus is more powerful than Malcador. I assume he is, but he's right up there. It probably goes the Emperor, Magnus the Red, and then Malcador. So, for being a smaller legion, this legion can bring to bear some abilities and mass that no other legion can really do. Many of the other legions for a time had a librarius and had psychers in their legions, but often those psychers were a bit one note on what abilities they had and what they could do. Whereas the Thousand Suns have psychers that have a myriad range of abilities and potency and powers. You could estimate the number of Astartes in the Thousand Suns to be right around 10,000 at their max, because they had, at one point, 10 different fellowships, each with about 1,000 members in them, instead of chapters of 1,000. They were called fellowships, and they eventually were reduced to 9 fellowships, so it's speculated that they were probably at around 9,000 total Space Marines at their full strength at any given time. And then broken down further, despite being one of the smaller legions, they had some of the more complex mixings of rank and how it worked. Because most of the legion were psychers, with very few just being your typical Space Marine with a bolter and melee weapon, if you showed aptitude for a certain type of psychic ability, you were given membership in one of 5 different cults. And each of these cults are called Athenians, Corvidae, Raptora, Pavoni, and Pyre. And so, for example, if you were very good at manipulating biological systems with your psychic abilities, like even to the point where you can kind of shape your face differently and stuff like that, that would put you in the Pavoni cult, for example. If your abilities were able to focus on reading minds and reading intent from people, that would put you in the Athenians cult. The Corvidae were the ones that could see the future and were led by Ahriman, notably, the most powerful of the Thousand Suns Space Marines. And then if you were into Pyre, that was focused on fire abilities and fire manipulation, pyrokinesis as it's called. And then the Raptora mastered the power of telekinesis, so like force abilities, like basically like like just using the physical brute force attacks from your psychic abilities. And so they were all split up into these specific cults. A fellowship could be made up of multiple members of these different cults, but it was not uncommon to have, for example, most of Ahriman's fellowship to be members of the Corvidae cult. It was just kind of, makes it easier if the Marines that you're working with have similar abilities to yourself as the captain or chief sorcerer of that specific fellowship. One of the other interesting things about the cults is there was a push and pull of ascendancy. Sometimes one cult would be in ascendance and be more powerful than another cult of discipline. So sometimes the Corvidae would be the most powerful. They'd be able to see the future clearly and be able to give the Legion great intelligence on coming campaigns. Or sometimes it would be the Pyre, who were in ascendance at the end of the Great Crusade. And that cult was insanely powerful. They could control legions of cybernetica, which were basically automata robots. So imagine just one Space Marine controlling hundreds of very powerful machines. You're force multiplying the use of that one Marine from being already a powerhouse on his own physically as well as psychically by also being able to deploy him with a bunch of automata he can control, along with any member of his cult that are also running automata. So in that way, you might be facing down 1,000 of these Space Marines, but each of those Marines is worth 200 of these machines, for example. It's just one of the cool ways the Thousand Suns basically multiplied their power level despite being much smaller numerically. And also related to the Pyre, one of the more unique traits with them is that they could even control Titans. At the burning of Prospero, when the Space Marines of the Space Wolves Legion assaulted the Thousand Suns. I'm going a little bit off track here, but it's a really cool, interesting, unique thing here. The leader of the Pyre was actually controlling a Titan, and the Titan was wreathed in psychic flame as he's controlling it. And he's just blasting enemy troops with tornadoes of flame, basically, cast from his mind. Like, it's just insane to think about that kind of power level coming from a Space Marine controlling a Titan. Just kind of cool. So powerful were the abilities of the Raptora that they could create gigantic kind shields, which are basically just a gigantic physical shell created out of psychic energy. So powerful were these shields that not only could they protect individuals, but they protected their entire capital city of Tisca on Prospero from orbital bombardment for hours from the Space Wolves Legion. Just another really cool aspect from this Legion. So combining all these cults together, you get a very dynamic force that can adapt all of them working together to defeat a given enemy with different applications of these forces. These cults didn't typically compete in a traditional way. They didn't hate each other for being, specialized differently usually. There was a couple of jokes given with like some of the cults being a bit more dumb, dumb-minded versus we're the Corvidae, we're very smart, we can see the future. There was a little bit of that sometimes, but normally they all worked pretty well together despite the discipline that they were specialized in as a psyker. And there's not really much said about what normal Space Marines in the Legion either were seen like or did not do. Certainly, no one of lesser ability in psychic powers was elevated to rank within the Legion, though. All of the top positions of rank and structure in this Legion were all very powerful psychers, with Ahriman being the top psyker of the Legion and second in command next to Magnus. And then all the other inner circle leaders were all very powerful leaders of each of these cults and fellowships. So your power and your mastery over psychic ability saw you rise in this legion more than any other way that you could rank up in the legion's hierarchy. One of the other unique things that the Thousand Sons Legion did to gain an edge over their bigger cousins was to actually send out their captains to basically learn underneath a chosen legion's tutelage. So many of the leadership of the Thousand Sons spent years sometimes with a chosen brother legion to learn their tactics and ways and bring that to the Thousand Sons Legion in a way to benefit that legion's overall battle doctrines. So some of what the Thousand Sons did in combat was directly influenced by other legions. They were not so prideful, even though they were sometimes perceived that way, that they would not adapt their abilities and their battle doctrines with knowledge that they learned from any source. And that's also something that I really love about this legion. They valued knowledge and applying that knowledge, no matter what it was, to a task at hand. They were not stubborn in just choosing one way to solve an issue. They chose usually the best method given to them by what they chose to learn and then apply that to that situation. Whereas some legions basically just, would bury an enemy in their bodies until they stopped moving. Not the Thousand Sons. They tended to apply the psychic ability that they had, along with general tactical ability, straight hardware and their, bolters and things like that, with great finesse and willingness to use any tactics that they learned to overcome a given task. Now, one of the other unique things about this legion, on terms of battle doctrines and equipment and things like that, is their Terminators. So they had a elite force of Terminators called the Scarab Occult, part of Ahriman's first company or first fellowship. And each of these Terminators, not only are they wearing Terminator armor, which makes them nearly indestructible in a lot of combat situations, like any normal Terminators are, but each of these men are also devoted and powerful psychers within the psychic cult system of the Thousand Sons Legion. They were all warrior mages. And it's said on the wiki that just one of these men was enough to subdue a world on their own. These members of the Sekhmet, as they're also called. I don't know how true that particularly is, but what is true is that these men were basically near power levels of Ahriman himself. I imagine that him and Magnus only picked the ones that were as close to them in power as possible. And they also usually formed the honor guard and bodyguard protection for Magnus himself. And Magnus would often lead these Terminators into direct combat against the most powerful of foes. At one point, Magnus even faced down a Eldar Titan on his own. Something this, hundreds of feet high. Magnus was able to take down on his own with his psychic abilities without the Sekhmet there. But combined with those men, along with Ahriman there, there's very few things that they probably could not destroy at their height of their power. The raw ability and power was something that many of the legions feared, which led directly to this legion censure later on. And so, I think part of that's fueled by a direct fear of their power, but also a jealousy that these other legions had, that despite the size of this legion, they were just miles above in terms of power that they could never even hope to hold if this legion ever turned against them. It's one of the reasons why the forces of chaos, along with Horus, wanted this legion out of the picture in the wider heresy, because if they would have been on the loyalist side, things would have turned out much differently with this legion at full power and at the behest of the Emperor. And so one of the main doctrines of this legion when they deployed were members of the cult would use their powers against an enemy to, turn the minds of the enemy troops against each other, blast them apart with telekinetic energies, light the very air on fire, preconceive where enemy forces would be, and then, completely flank around them, and then take them out with massed bolter fire. You basically think of it, the Thousand Sons could probably employ it with the adaptability that their abilities gave them in any given situation. I mean, they could even turn enemies like legs to jelly, depending on the type of enemy they're fighting. The raw psychic ability gave them a multi-tool in more ways than one that they could use to basically take down an enemy of most power and size. And so this Legion, I don't think they had a ton of compliance actions, but the ones they did accomplish, they accomplished with a thorough scouring of the enemy. And one of the other unique things, though, about this Legion was, in terms of doctrines, is they were not overly destructive, usually. They would usually find places of knowledge and protect those places and retrieve that knowledge for the betterment of the Legion, as well as they felt for the betterment of humanity. They wouldn't just hide it away from teaching the other legions. Magnus and Ahriman definitely thought that there was a benefit in their doctrines to disseminate that out to their brothers. And it just wasn't something that a lot of the other legions would do. There was a few others that also valued, preserving knowledge, but the Thousand Sons that's one of their main tools, is to gain knowledge and apply that forward in their next battle, and also just in general to enhance people's lives. It was kind of one of their main values, I guess you can say, for being a smaller legion. And one of the other unique things about this legion, in terms of abilities, was they also all carried with them what's basically a warp entity. And these were called tutelaries, and they're basically some form of lesser demon. As for why the Emperor never brought up that they were demons to Magnus or Ahriman, who knows? But most of the Thousand Sons Space Marines each had a tutelary, which was basically this. They all looked kind of like geometric shapes, kind of jigsawing around and moving together and away from each other. And for example, members of the Terminator Sekhmet Scarab cult could use their tutelaries to go into a hiding place of an enemy and burn them out, or give them general advice, or help pour their power into a psychic ability. And the double-bladed side of these tutelaries was that some of them would turn on their masters eventually and burn them out, especially during the burning of Prospero. A lot of the tutelaries turned on their long-term companions in the Thousand Sons. But for a long time, they were used as kind of an advisory type of function, as well as direct combat sometimes. And then beyond the psychic abilities, the as far as equipment, they all wore power armor, just like normal Space Marines would. And most of them had a bolter that they still used, but they would often use psychic ability to guide the bolt shells true to their targets. And they would also use their psychic abilities to clean their bolters, pull them apart, put them back together psychically. Along with that, they still had some melee weapons. Most of their melee weapons were not chainswords, though. Uniquely in this legion, they all tended to have Egyptian-inspired weapons, uniquely known as a khopesh, for example. Not many, I should say. For the most part, the Thousand Sons fought at range with their abilities, and if they also were going to use any actual shots, it was bolter fire that they would use, along maybe with ranged weaponry from some types of tank support. They did have some armored units, but this legion did not really have a lot of dedicated armor to them. Maybe some transports and some tanks, but not a lot on that front. So they had khopeshes, and even though they fought mostly at range, several of the members of this legion were some of the best swordsmen, comparable to top swordsmen like Sigismund or Lucius of the Emperor's Children Legion at the time. But mostly they used their ranged weaponry. But you had the khopesh. The Ranged users like Ahriman and other powerful psychers tended to have a channeling instrument like a staff of some kind to help focus their minds in the use of their psychic abilities in combat. And one other thing that should be noted is like members of the Legion like Ahriman, he might have been a master of the Corvidae, but he could also use flame abilities of like the other cults. So even if you didn't specialize in one of the other cults, you weren't stopped from using the abilities of those other ones, further increasing this Legion's ability to adapt to a situation. And the Marines could often cross-train with each other, even if their specific specialization was just one of the types of psychic abilities. Some of the other unique equipment that this Legion would employ were a type of cannon called a Aether Fire Cannon. All that's really mentioned about it is that it's developed by the Pyrite cult Tech Marine artificers, and that these plasma weapons are modified using both occult lore and unique techno-arcana of the Forge world of Zhao Arcad. So I'm not entirely sure what they do. I imagine, though, that the plasma becomes more lethal. Maybe it's a homing plasma of some kind. I don't know entirely. It's possible that the rules for the tabletop version of the game, of the world, would kind of inform us a bit more on that. I don't know the exact rules. Someone could leave a comment if they want to explain more about it. And then likewise, along with that is what are known as asphyx shells, which are tainted with psychoreactive toxin of unknown origins. So I imagine perhaps you could use those against a enemy psyker, and it might the toxin might hurt psykers more that the Thousand Sons were fighting against at times. I'm not entirely sure there either. It's possible they were developed to fight against the Psychonuan, which were a type of wasp, insectoid type creature living on Prospero, and was a deadly monster on that world. That kind of gave the rest of the world a death world type of feel to it. And so to wrap things up here a little bit, a few last things to know about this Legion. Fleet-wise, they didn't really have a huge fleet to speak about. They did have one Gloriana class battleship, which were always formidable in their own right. And then as for human supporting troops, they did have some dedicated Prospero-based soldiers called the Prosperine Guard or Spire Guard. And they were typically the defenders of Prospero, and I don't really recall seeing them on deployment with the Space Marines for compliance actions, but this group of type of Imperial Guard were kind of unique in both their being taught by the Thousand Sons directly, and so they were probably a bit more well-trained than your normal Guard units. So even when they were being, if they were ever used in any compliance actions, they were probably a bit more useful than your typical Guard unit, having been trained directly by the Thousand Sons to some degree. And so, other than that, that's really a bit about a brief overview of the Thousand Sons in terms of combat doctrine. It ended up not being too super brief this time, only because I know a lot more about this Legion, and really they just have a fascinating twist on the normal general fighting that a lot of Space Marine Legions do, both in how they're organized and in their fighting styles and doctrines. So as always, please leave a like and subscribe if you'd like to see more of this content from me, and leave a comment if you'd like to discuss anything. I always like to discuss with each of you any topic Warhammer related on the video or not. Next video is going to be on the Death Guard Legion. They are the 14th Legion, and they are the Thousand Sons' best friends in the whole wide world, if you know anything about them. So it should be a fun one. Last video I did for the Death Guard got a lot of people looking at that one. Seems to be a lot of Death Guard fans out there. As always, bring your light into the dark places, and I will see you in the next video. I hope you have a great day or night wherever you are, and we will see each other very soon. Thank you for your time.